In the summer of 1940, Britain suffers heavy naval losses during a devastating defeat at Dunkirk. As a consequence, many convoys are forced to travel with only one escort, and this makes them easy prey for the wolf packs. For the new British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, the consequences of the U-boat menace are stark.
Churchill famously says that the only thing that truly terrified him and kept him awake at night was the U-boat peril. And you can understand why, because all shipping flows into Britain via the Atlantic, whether it's coming from Australia, whether it's coming from India. And without those supplies, Nazi Germany cannot be defeated. So Britain as a base from which to attack Nazi Germany is absolutely vital.
During Britain's darkest hour, Churchill asked foreign navies for help escorting merchant ships. And Canada is the first to step up, but they pay a heavy price at the hands of the wolf packs.
Canadians were very loyal to and sympathetic to Britain. They were very, very close as nations, and so the Canadians and the Canadian public were very behind the war effort. So the Canadians very quickly had to scramble and try and build up their navy.
The Canadian Navy offers a number of small ships called corvettes, but these vessels are slow, and many are slaughtered by the Germans. Canada suffers huge losses as a result.
Overall, the Canadians lost over 4,500 sailors, which for a small country like Canada is an enormously high number. So they did really sacrifice their lives to try and keep Britain, in a sense, from having to fall out of the war.
In America, President Franklin D. Roosevelt tries to rally public support for Britain, but it's a tough sell.
He tried to convince the American population that it was in America's national interest that those convoys made it across the North Atlantic, but it was very much an uphill struggle for him because the American public opinion was so thoroughly isolationist.
Churchill is so concerned about Britain's merchant ships that in August 1941, he makes his own perilous journey across the Atlantic to meet FDR.
It was wartime. It was such a risk. What would have happened if Churchill had been on a vessel that had been sunk?
At a secret conference at Placentia Bay, the two political heavyweights meet in person for the very first time.
Churchill was the one in need. He needed to go to Franklin Roosevelt and say, anything you can give us, any help you can provide, any material goods, any support, even a pat on the back, anything you can provide will help us survive. It became clear to Churchill that Roosevelt was on his side, but that Roosevelt, as a politician, as a great politician, knew he had to proceed in very careful small steps.
The US gives 50 First World War destroyers to Britain in exchange for a 99-year lease on 8 of the country's naval bases.
And then in addition to that, he sent out ships to accompany convoys. Well, now wait a minute. If a warship is accompanying a convoy, isn't that effectively an escort? And Roosevelt, being the politician that he was, would say, well, no, just because you call a cow a horse doesn't make it a cow. It's accompanying, it's not an escort. Don't you know the difference between a cow and a horse?
In May 1941, notorious submarine commander Julius Lemp is commanding the U-110 when he makes a rash decision that changes the course of the Second World War.
This is our old friend Julius Lemp, he who sunk the Athenia on the first day of the war. He's attacked by several destroyers at one time, and they're caught on the surface and he can't submerge quick enough.
Lemp orders his crew to abandon the damaged U-110, but fails to follow protocol when he doesn't scupper the submarine to ensure it sinks after they evacuate.
When the U-boat did not sink instantly, as it was obviously hoped by Lemp, he actually swam back, probably trying to get back on board and to destroy the secret materials.
Lemp's desperate act of courage is an attempt to protect a precious secret on board the U-boat. But in a moment of great fortune for the Allies, Lemp doesn't survive the swim, and the British capture the vessel intact. On board, they discover something that will tip the balance in their favor: an Enigma machine.
The British intelligence services were elated. Bletchley Park had information that really mattered, and you could see exactly how it worked. And that was immensely powerful. It meant that they could divert the convoys around where the U-boats were appearing to congregate.
Because the Germans think the U-110 sank, they have no idea their Enigma machine is now in the enemy's hands. For the British, it's imperative the Germans never realize they've cracked the Enigma code. But this throws up some ethical dilemmas.
Although it was very troubling, there were some incidents where vessels were actually allowed to go into peril so that they didn't hint the Germans that they'd cracked the codes. Because what do? Do you save, in the short term, save this small group of people's lives and save these vessels? Or do you sacrifice them in a way for the, I suppose, greater good? And that's what was decided on a number of occasions. But it just shows that the tragedy of war, the dilemmas that people face in wartime.
In December 1941, Japan launches a surprise strike on a US military base at Pearl Harbor.
The American public was so infuriated by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. We were at peace. They did it in secret. They did it on a Sunday morning, those dirty, rotten bad guys. American public opinion was such that they wanted to go and get the Japanese immediately.
Now Roosevelt has the public on side. He officially declares war with the Axis powers. In the Atlantic, this means American ships are now fair game. And Dönitz sends long-range U-boats to attack America's east coast. They sneak into American ports and sink unprotected ships and oil tankers, causing devastation from New York all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. In what becomes known by the Nazis as the Second Happy Time, the U-boats sink 400 American vessels at the cost of 5,000 lives.
It was shocking to the American public that the war had at last come home to their home waters.
The US responds with an immense shipbuilding project.
Roosevelt immediately calls for a massive increase in the number of ships that are going to be built. And in 1942, he calls for 8 million tons of ships to be built.
Every time a U-boat sinks a military, transport, or cargo ship, it's quickly replaced. But not all of the new warships go to the Atlantic, because there's also a strong demand for vessels in the Pacific, where the US Navy is fighting Japan at the same time.
Roosevelt had earlier agreed that Germany would come first, was the prime enemy. A lot of American influential figures in Washington believed that actually Japan should be seen as the principal enemy.
The Navy, personified by the new Chief of Naval Operations, Ernest King, said, well, we just can't let the Japanese have the run of the Pacific until Germany's beaten. You have to give us some support now.
Because so many of the new warships go straight to the Pacific, in 1942, there are fewer escorts in the Atlantic than before the US entered the war. just when things couldn't get worse for the Allies, Dönitz correctly suspects the enemy can understand U-boat communication.
Dönitz just starts to smell a rat. I mean, he doesn't think it can be possible that the Enigma codes have been cracked. He thinks it's a traitor in his midst that's spilling the beans, rather than the fact that cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park have actually been doing the hard yards.
Dönitz insists a fourth wheel is added to the Enigma device, multiplying the possible settings by 26 times.
This made it much more difficult for everybody at Bletchley because they just crack the codes, think everything's fine, and then they turn around and it was a blackout. It didn't work anymore.
The Allies realize to have a chance of victory in the Atlantic, they must take on a more aggressive approach to killing U-boats. The British set up the Western Approaches Tactical Unit in Liverpool to develop their anti-submarine strategy. It's staffed by the Women's Royal Naval Service, also known as the Wrens.
The Wrens were given the task, effectively, to play kind of war games, to try and figure out what do you do if you're a convoy or if you're a vessel that's being attacked.
The Wrens played giant games of battleships on a linoleum floor and restage previous ocean battles between escorts and U-boats.
One of these games was called Operation Raspberry, like blowing a raspberry to Hitler, actually. By going through all of these different permutations as to how you react, we're able to figure out how to best protect the merchant marine.
And what they're doing is they're looking at patterns and seeing how U-boats are deploying, using the data that has been accrued from intercepted convoys and from attacks by U-boats, and trying to work out and improve how the escorts can better protect their convoys and better kill U-boats.
The Wrens make huge tactical breakthroughs and teach counterattacks to thousands of naval officers.
Officers would go back to their ships, and when they were attacked, they would put these war games into effect practically. These tactics were very successful. The Wrens were applauded for their tremendous work. The whole techniques of the convoys was changed thanks to Raspberry.
These new tactics are put into exemplary use by Captain Johnny Walker, a legendary U-boat killer. Walker commands a huge escort group of 500 men who travel ahead of convoys and hunt down U-boats.
You have created a record in having sunk, well and truly, no doubt about them, 6 German U-boats.
The German U-boats, who have been the hunters since 1939, now became the hunted.
Allied commanders asked Churchill for long-range aircraft to help Walker's escort groups reach a 180,000 square mile gap in the middle of the Atlantic, where the U-boats hide.
The so-called Atlantic Gap, the black hole. That's where the U-boats could congregate and where it was impossible to attack the U-boats effectively because you were so far from land. Most aircraft couldn't reach.
Walker wants long-range bombers to help close the mid-Atlantic air gap. But they've all been allocated to the head of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris.
Harris, whose nickname was Bomber Harris, wanted to use every available airplane he could get his hands on to bomb German cities. He was convinced that if you put enough bombs on enough German cities, it would undermine morale, it would overthrow Hitler, it could end the war without an invasion, that strategic bombing could win the war.
When the storm bursts over Germany, they will look back to the days of Lübeck and Rostock and Cologne as a man caught in the blasts of a hurricane will look back to the gentle zephyrs of last summer.
Churchill, I think he thought rightly that Bomber Harris was a pretty crude character, but he quite liked his aggressive, bombastic sense of can do, will destroy them from the air.
Churchill gives the long-range bombers to Harris instead of sending them out to protect the British Navy. The mid-Atlantic gap remains a safe haven for the U-boats to hide and threaten Britain's lifeline. By January 1943, the tides of war are turning for Hitler on all fronts, and there's trouble within the Naval High Command. Admiral Raeder has just suffered a humiliating defeat in the Battle of the Barents Sea. It's his second big loss, after the British Navy assembled a large force of aircraft and warships to hunt down and sink Hitler's beloved Bismarck.
The sinking of the Bismarck was a heavy blow. She represented 1/4 of the strength of the German battle fleet. This was actually the end of Raeder's surface strategy.
The big ships he was in favor of hadn't proven very successful against the convoys. Hitler was enraged and he said, Raeder, you always were in favor of these big battleships and you promised me success.
Hitler dismisses Raeder and swiftly promotes Dönitz to be the new commander-in-chief of the Kriegsmarine. Dönitz finally has the naval crown and the 300 U-boats he's always wanted. But has it all come too late? The power balance in the Atlantic has changed again. The Allies now have the technological edge with new weapons like the Hedgehog and radar detection systems.
The German protocol of attacking on the surface at night so that ASDIC didn't affect them was now neutralized by virtue of the fact that the Allies had radar and could see them in the dark. That changed the dynamic dramatically.
When the British Navy finally gets support from long-range aircraft in 1943, the Allies close the mid-Atlantic gap.
The moment that they closed the net on pretty much the entire Atlantic, it's sort of game over for the U-boats. These liberators, these B-24 liberators, are armed to the hilt with rockets, with cannons, with torpedoes, with bombs, absolutely everything. And when they see a U-boat, they just go straight in for it, absolutely smother it.
By this stage of the war, U-boat crews have the highest death rate of all the German forces. The celebrated aces of the past have long gone, and their expertise has been lost with them. Despite the inexperience of the ever-younger crews, on the 5th of May 1943, Dönitz sends 30 U-boats after a large convoy. They're no match for the Allies' defense, and 7 submarines never return. It's the biggest one-day loss for Dönitz, and things only get worse during what becomes known as Black May.
May 1943 is the decisive month because over 40 U-boats are sunk, and that is totally unsustainable. What Dönitz realizes is that his crews are becoming ever more inexperienced, and they are just being lambs to the slaughter.
And it was also a turning point for him personally because his son Peter was killed on one of these U-boats that was sunk by the British Navy.
After May 1943, Dönitz finally accepts the convoys are too well defended and pulls his submarines out of the North Atlantic.
He went to Hitler and said, Mein Führer, our U-boats don't sink enough, our losses are too high. We have to withdraw from the Northern Atlantic.
Despite this, Dönitz reassures Hitler all is not lost and enthuses about a new, faster type of U-boat that can remain underwater with a snorkel.
Dönitz told Hitler, look, the U-boats are still the way in which to win this war. There are new technologies coming. More powerful, longer-range U-boats. But his core was, I can do this.
Neither Dönitz nor Hitler believed that would be the final end of the U-boat war, and they hoped that they could at some point regain the initiative. So they didn't realize at that moment that it was the final defeat, actually.
Dönitz continues to send crews into the Atlantic, telling his men their presence is a success in itself and sinking merchant ships a bonus.
At the end of the war, most of the U-boats then with inexperienced crews were sunk on their first missions. What a waste of life.
The great tragedy of the Battle of the Atlantic is even after May of 1943, when it's recognized by both sides that the U-boat cannot cut the lifeline to Britain. It goes on anyway because nobody can see an alternative.
Now the Allies have control of the Atlantic. They finally have the ocean launch pad they need for an amphibious invasion of the French coast.
The lifeline between the United States and Britain was secure, and that meant it was possible for the Allies safely to land on the soil of Europe, D-Day.
When their troops disembark at Normandy on the 6th of June 1944, they catch the Germans by surprise, and all of the U-boats are still in harbor.
Dönitz gave an order that you have to attack. It's worth the price, even if your boat is lost. Attack, even if you just sink one war vessel, it helps us to win this war.
35 U-boats are sent out to counter the D-Day offensive, but only 5 return.
They had no impact whatsoever on D-Day, which, however, could not have taken place until the Battle of Atlantic had been won.
Dönitz's ideological commitment in the face of defeat may be why Hitler chooses him to be his successor when the dictator commits suicide the following year.
Hitler's demented vision of a 1,000-year Reich has collapsed. And he has one person who he knows to be unequivocally loyal and passionate as a Nazi beside him still, Admiral Dönitz.
He was the last he could rely on. And so he hoped Dönitz would fight on till the bitter end.
But even Dönitz can see the writing is on the wall, and as Berlin falls, he asks his men to surrender.
He clearly sees the war is lost. Germany is beaten down to his knees, and the only option is to end the war as soon as possible, to end all the suffering for the German people, but also for the other nations.
If Hitler had given Dönitz 300 U-boats at the start of the war, the outcome in the Atlantic may have been very different.
Because so much of what Britain needs and what the United States needs is coming across the Atlantic. Resources, men, machinery, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel. You'd had no D-Day, you'd had no North Africa, you'd have no Sicily and Italy. That makes the Battle of the Atlantic the single most important battle in the entire Second World War.
The Allied victory in the Atlantic was a prerequisite for D-Day, and defeating the Nazis may never have happened without it.
It was fundamentally important to the ability of the Western Allies to secure peace, freedom, democracy for Western Europe. Without victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, that would not have been possible.